This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Sirois, michael.sirois, sirois.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 3. Count de Maubec de la Dentulinx. The morals of the Jews were not always pure. In most cases they were averse from none of the vices of Christian civilization, but they retained from the patriarchal age a recognition of family ties and an attachment to the interests of the tribe. Pyrot's brothers, half-brothers, uncles, great-uncles, first, second, and third cousins, nephews and great-nephews, relations by blood and relations by marriage, and all who were related to him, to the number of about 700, were at first overwhelmed by the blow that had struck their relative, and they shut themselves up in their houses, covering themselves with ashes and blessing the hand that had chastised them. For 40 days they kept a strict fast. Then they bathed themselves and resolved to search, without rest, at the cost of any toil and at the risk of every danger, for the demonstration of an innocence which they did not doubt. And how could they have doubted? Pyrot's innocence had been revealed to them in the same way that his guilt had been revealed to Christian Penguinia. For these things, being hidden, assume a mystic character and take on the authority of religious truths. The 700 Pyrotists set to work with as much zeal as prudence and made the most thorough inquiries in secret. They were everywhere, they were seen nowhere. One would have said that, like the pilot of Ulysses, they wandered freely over the earth. They penetrated into the War Office and approached, under different disguises, the judges, the registrars, and the witnesses of the affair. Then Greatauk's cleverness was seen. The witnesses knew nothing. The judges and registrars knew nothing. Emissaries reached even Pyrot and anxiously questioned him in his cage, amid the prolonged moanings of the sea and the hoarse croaks of the ravens. It was in vain. The prisoner knew nothing. The 700 Pyrotists could not subvert the proofs of the accusation because they could not know what they were, and they could not know what they were because there were none. Pyrot's guilt was indefeasible through its very nullity, and it was with a legitimate pride that Greatauk, expressing himself as a true artist, said one day to General Panther, "This case is a masterpiece. It is made out of nothing." The 700 Pyrotists despaired of ever clearing up this dark business, when suddenly they discovered, from a stolen letter, that the 80,000 trusses of hay had never existed, that a most distinguished nobleman, Count de Maubec, had sold them to the State, that he had received the price, but had never delivered them. Indeed, seeing that he was descended from the richest landed proprietors of ancient Penguinia, the heir of the Maubecs of Dentulinx, once the possessors of 4 duchies, 60 counties, and 612 marquisates, baronies, and viscounties, he did not possess as much land as he could cover with his hand, and would not have been able to cut a single day's mowing of forage off his own domains. As to his getting a single rush from a landowner or a merchant, that would have been quite impossible, for everybody except the ministers of state and the government officials knew that it would be easier to get blood from a stone than a farthing from a Maubec. The 700 Pyrotists made a minute inquiry concerning the Count Maubec de Dentulinx's financial resources, and they proved that the nobleman was chiefly supported by a house in which some generous ladies were ready to furnish all comers with the most lavish hospitality. They publicly proclaimed that he was guilty of the theft of the 80,000 trusses of straw, for which an innocent man had been condemned and was now imprisoned in the cage. Maubec belonged to an illustrious family which was allied to the Draconides. There is nothing that a democracy esteems more highly than noble birth. Maubec had also served in the Penguin army, and since the Penguins were all soldiers, they loved their army to idolatry. Maubec, on the field of battle, had received the cross, which is a sign of honour among the Penguins, and which they valued even more highly than the embraces of their wives. All Penguinia declared for Maubec, and the voice of the people, which began to assume a threatening tone, demanded severe punishments for the 700 calumniating Pyrotists. Maubec was a nobleman. He challenged the 700 Pyrotists to combat with either sword, sabre, pistols, carabines, or sticks. "Vile dogs," he wrote to them in a famous letter, "you have crucified my God, and you want my life too. I warn you that I will not be such a duffer as he was, and that I will cut off your 1400 ears. Accept my boot on your 700 behinds." The chief of the government at the time was a peasant called Robin Mielleux, a man pleasant to the rich and powerful, but hard towards the poor, a man of small courage and ignorant of his own interests. In a public declaration he guaranteed Maubec's innocence and honour, and presented the 700 Pyrotists to the criminal courts, where they were condemned as libellers to imprisonment, to enormous fines, and to all the damages that were claimed by their innocent victim. It seemed as if Pyrot was destined to remain for ever shut in the cage on which the ravens perched. But all the Penguins being anxious to know and prove that this Jew was guilty, all the proofs brought forward were found not to be good, while some of them were also contradictory. The officers of the staff showed zeal but lacked prudence. Whilst Greatauk kept an admirable silence, General Panther made inexhaustible speeches, and every morning demonstrated to the newspapers that the condemned man was guilty. He would have done better, perhaps, if he had said nothing. The guilt was evident, and what is evident cannot be demonstrated. So much reasoning disturbed people's minds. Their faith, though still alive, became less serene. The more proofs one gives a crowd, the more they ask for. Nevertheless, the danger of proving too much would not have been great if there had not been in Penguinia, as there are indeed everywhere, minds framed for free inquiry, capable of studying a difficult question, and inclined to philosophic doubt. They were few, they were not all inclined to speak, and the public was by no means inclined to listen to them. Still, they did not always meet with deaf ears. The great Jews, all the Israelite millionaires of Alca, when spoken to of Pyrot, said, "We do not know the man," but they thought of saving him. They preserved the prudence to which their wealth inclined them, and wished that others would be less timid. Their wish was to be gratified. End of Book 6, Chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Sirois, Michael.Sirois, SIROIS.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 4, Colomban. Some weeks after the conviction of the 700 Pyrotists, a little, gruff, hairy, short-sighted man left his house one morning with a paste-pot, a ladder, and a bundle of posters, and went about the streets pasting placards to the walls on which might be read in large letters, "Pyrot is innocent, Maubec is guilty." He was not a bill poster. His name was Colomban, and as the author of 60 volumes on penguin sociology, he was numbered among the most laborious and respected writers in Alca. Having given sufficient thought to the matter, and no longer doubting Pyrot's innocence, he proclaimed it in the manner which he thought would be the most sensational. He met with no hindrance while posting his bills in the quiet streets, but when he came to the populous quarters, every time he mounted his ladder, inquisitive people crowded round him and, dumbfounded with surprise and indignation, threw at him threatening looks, which he received with the calm that comes from courage and short-sightedness. Whilst caretakers and tradespeople tore down the bills he had posted, he kept on zealously placarding, carrying his tools and followed by little boys who, with their baskets under their arms or their satchels on their backs, were in no hurry to reach school. To the mute indignation against him, protests and murmurs were now added, but Colomban did not condescend to see or hear anything. As, at the entrance to the Rue St. Orberosia, he was posting one of his squares of paper bearing the words, "Pyrot is innocent, Maubec is guilty," the riotous crowd showed signs of the most violent anger. They called after him, "Traitor! Thief! Rascal! Scoundrel!" A woman opened a window and emptied a vase full of filth over his head. A cabby sent his hat flying from one end of the street to the other by a blow of his whip, amid the cheers of the crowd, who now felt themselves avenged. A butcher's boy knocked Colomban with his paste pot, his brush, and his posters from the top of his ladder into the gutter, and the proud Penguins then felt the greatness of their country. Colomban stood up, covered with filth, lame, and with his elbow injured, but tranquil and resolute. "Lo, brutes!" he muttered, shrugging his shoulders. Then he went down on all fours in the gutter to look for his glasses which he had lost in the fall. It was then seen that his coat was split from the collar to the tails, and that his trousers were in rags. The rancour of the crowd grew stronger. On the other side of the street stretched the big St. Orberosian stores. The patriots seized whatever they could lay their hands on from the shop front, and hurled at Colomban oranges, lemons, pots of jam, pieces of chocolate, bottles of liqueurs, boxes of sardines, pots of foie gras, hams, fowls, flasks of oil, and bags of haricots. Covered with the débris of the food, bruised, tattered, lame, and blind, he took to flight, followed by the shop boys, bakers, loafers, citizens, and hooligans, whose number increased each moment, and who kept shouting, "Duck him! Death to the traitor! Duck him!" This torrent of vulgar humanity swept along the streets and rushed into the Rue St. Maël. The police did their duty. From all the adjacent streets constables proceeded, and holding their scabbards with their left hands, they went at full speed in front of their pursuers. They were on the point of grabbing Colomban in their huge hands, when he suddenly escaped them by falling through an open manhole to the bottom of a sewer. He spent the night there in the darkness, sitting close by the dirty water amidst the fat and slimy rats. He thought of his task, and his swelling heart filled with courage and pity. And when the dawn threw a pale ray of light into the air hole, he got up and said, speaking to himself, "I see that the fight will be a stiff one." Forthwith he composed a memorandum in which he clearly showed that Pyrot could not have stolen from the Ministry of War the 80,000 trusses of hay which it had never received, for the reason that Maubec had never delivered them, though he had received the money. Colomban caused this statement to be distributed in the streets of Alca. The people refused to read it and tore it up in anger. The shopkeepers shook their fists at the distributors, who made off, chased by angry women armed with brooms. Feelings grew warm and the ferment lasted the whole day. In the evening bands of wild and ragged men went about the streets yelling, "Death to Colomban!" The patriots snatched whole bundles of the memorandum from the newsboys and burned them in the public squares, dancing wildly round these bonfires with girls whose petticoats were tied up to their waists. Some of the more enthusiastic among them went and broke the windows of the house in which Colomban had lived in perfect tranquillity during his 40 years of work. Parliament was roused and asked the chief of the government what measures he proposed to take in order to repel the odious attacks made by Colomban upon the honour of the national arm and the safety of Penguinia. Robin Mielleux denounced Colomban's impious audacity and proclaimed amid the cheers of the legislators that the man would be summoned before the courts to answer for his infamous libel. The Minister of War was called to the tribune and appeared in it transfigured. He had no longer the air, as in former days, of one of the sacred geese of the Penguin citadels. Now bristling with outstretched neck and hooked beak, he seemed the symbolic vulture fastened to the livers of the country's enemies. In the august silence of the assembly he pronounced these words only: "I swear that Pyrot is a rascal." This speech of Greatauk was reported all over Penguinia and satisfied the public conscience. End of Book 6, Chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Serrois, michael.serrois, SIROIS.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 5. The Reverend Fathers Agaric and Cornemuse. Colomban bore with meekness and surprise the weight of the general reprobation. He could not go out without being stoned, so he did not go out. He remained in his study with a superb obstinacy, writing new memoranda in favour of the encaged innocent. In the meantime, among the few readers that he found, some, about a dozen, were struck by his reasons and began to doubt Pyrot's guilt. They broached the subject to their friends and endeavoured to spread the light that had arisen in their minds. One of them was a friend of Robin Mielleux and confided to him his perplexities, with the result that he was no longer received by that minister. Another demanded explanations in an open letter to the Minister of War. A third published a terrible pamphlet. The latter, whose name was Kerdanic, was a formidable controversialist. The public was unmoved. It was said that these defenders of the traitor had been bribed by the rich Jews. They were stigmatized by the name of Pyrotists, and the patriots swore to exterminate them. There were only 1,000 or 1,200 Pyrotists in the whole vast republic, but it was believed that they were everywhere. People were afraid of finding them in the promenades, at meetings, at receptions, in fashionable drawing rooms, at the dinner table, even in the conjugal couch. One half of the population was suspected by the other half. The discord set all Alca on fire. In the meantime, Father Agaric, who managed his big school for young nobles, followed events with anxious attention. The misfortunes of the Penguin Church had not disheartened him. He remained faithful to Prince Crucho and preserved the hope of restoring the heir of the Draconides to the Penguin throne. It appeared to him that the events that were happening, or about to happen, in the country, the state of mind of which they were at once the effect and the cause, and the troubles that necessarily resulted from them might, if they were directed, guided, and led by the profound wisdom of a monk, overthrow the Republic and incline the Penguins to restore Prince Crucho, from whose piety the faithful hoped for so much solace. Wearing his huge black hat, the brims of which looked like the wings of night, he walked through the wood of Connels towards the factory where his venerable friend, Father Cornemuse, distilled the hygienic St. Orberosian liqueur. The good monk's industry, so cruelly affected in the time of Emiral Chatillon, was being restored from its ruins. One heard goods trains rumbling through the wood, and one saw in the sheds hundreds of orphans, clothed in blue, packing bottles and nailing up cases. Agaric found the venerable Cornemuse standing before his stoves and surrounded by his retorts. The shining pupils of the old man's eyes had again become as rubies. His skull shone with its former elaborate and careful polish. Agaric first congratulated the pious distiller on the restored activity of his laboratories and workshops.
"Business is recovering, I thank God for it,"
answered the old man of Connels.
"Alas, it had fallen into a bad state, Brother Agaric. You saw the desolation of this establishment. I need say no more."
Agaric turned away his head.
"The St. Orberosian liqueur,"
continued Cornemuse,
"is making fresh conquests, but none the less my industry remains uncertain and precarious. The laws of ruin and desolation that struck it have not been abrogated, they have only been suspended."
And the monk of Connels lifted his ruby eyes to heaven. Agaric put his hand on his shoulder.
"What a sight, Cornemuse, does unhappy Penguinia present to us! Everywhere disobedience, independence, liberty. We seethe proud. The haughty, the men of revolt rising up. After having braved the divine laws, they now rear themselves against human laws. So true is it that in order to be a good citizen a man must be a good Christian. Colomban is trying to imitate Satan. Numerous criminals are following his fatal example. They want in their rage to put aside all checks, to throw off all yokes, to free themselves from the most sacred bonds, to escape the most salutary restraints. They strike their country to make it obey them. But they will be overcome by the weight of public animadversion, vituperation, indignation, fury, execration, and abomination. That is the abyss to which they have been led by atheism, free thought, and the monstrous claim to judge for themselves and to form their own opinions." "Doubtless, doubtless,"
replied Father Cornemuse, shaking his head.
"But I confess that the care of distilling these simples has prevented me from following public affairs. I only know that people are talking a great deal about a man called Pyrot. Some maintain that he is guilty, others affirm that he is innocent, but I do not clearly understand the motives that drive both parties to mix themselves up in a business that concerns neither of them."
The pious Agaric said eagerly,
"You do not doubt Pyrot's guilt?" "I cannot doubt it, dear Agaric," answered the monk of Conils. "That would be contrary to the laws of my country, which we ought to respect, as long as they are not opposed to the divine laws. Pyrot is guilty, for he has been convicted. As to saying more for or against his guilt, that would be to erect my own authority against that of the judges, a thing which I will take good care not to do. Besides, it is useless, for Pyrot has been convicted. If he has not been convicted because he is guilty, he is guilty because he has been convicted. It comes to the same thing. I believe in his guilt, as every good citizen ought to believe in it, and I will believe in it as long as the established jurisdiction will order me to believe in it, for it is not for a private person, but for a judge to proclaim the innocence of a convicted person. Human justice is venerable, even in the errors inherent in its fallible and limited nature. These errors are never irreparable. If the judges do not repair them on earth, God will repair them in heaven. Besides, I have great confidence in General Greatauk, who, though he certainly does not look it, seems to me to be an abler man than all those who are attacking him." "Dearest Cornemuse," cried the pious Agaric, "the Pyrot affair, if pushed to the point whither we can lead it by the help of God and the necessary funds, will produce the greatest benefits. It will lay bare the vices of this anti-Christian republic, and will incline the Penguins to restore the throne of the Draconides and the prerogatives of the Church. But to do that it is necessary for the people to see the clergy in the front rank of its defenders. Let us march against the enemies of the army, against those who insult our heroes, and everybody will follow us."
"Everybody will be too many," murmured the monk of Conils, shaking his head.
"I see that the Penguins want to quarrel. If we mix ourselves up in their quarrel, they will become reconciled at our expense, and we shall have to pay the cost of the war. That is why, if you are guided by me, dear Agaric, you will not engage the Church in this adventure." "You know my energy, you know my prudence. I will compromise nothing. Dear Cornemuse, I only want from you the funds necessary for us to begin the campaign."
For a long time Cornemuse refused to bear the expenses of what he thought was a fatal enterprise. Agaric was in turn pathetic and terrible. At last, yielding to his prayers and threats, Cornemuse, with banging head and swinging arms, went to the austere cell that concealed his evangelical poverty. In the whitewashed wall, under a branch of blessed box, there was fixed a safe. He opened it, and with a sigh took out a bundle of bills, which with hesitating hands he gave to the pious Agaric.
"Do not doubt it, dear Cornemuse," said the latter, thrusting the papers into the pocket of his overcoat. "This Pyrot affair has been sent us by God for the glory and exaltation of the Church of Penguinia."
"I pray that you may be right," sighed the monk of Conils. And, left alone in his laboratory, he gazed through his exquisite eyes with an ineffable sadness at his stoves and his retorts. End of Book 6, Chapter 5. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Serrois. Michael.Serrois, SIROIS.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 6. The 700 Pyrotists. The 700 Pyrotists inspired the public with an increasing aversion. Every day 2 or 3 of them were beaten to death in the streets. One of them was publicly whipped, another thrown into the river, a third tarred and feathered and led through a laughing crowd, a fourth had his nose cut off by a captain of dragoons. They did not dare to show themselves at their clubs, at tennis, or at the races. They put on a disguise when they went to the stock exchange. In these circumstances the Prince des Boscénos thought it urgent to curb their audacity and repress their insolence. For this purpose he joined with Count Cléna, Monsieur de La Trumelle, Viscount Olive, and Monsieur Bigourd in founding a great anti-Pyrotist association to which citizens in hundreds of thousands, soldiers in companies, regiments, brigades, divisions, and army corps, towns, districts, and provinces all gave their adhesion. About this time the Minister of War, happening to visit one day his Chief of Staff, saw with surprise that the large room where General Panther worked, which was formerly quite bare, had now along each wall from floor to ceiling, in sets of deep pigeonholes, triple and quadruple rows of paper bundles of every form and colour. These sudden and monstrous records had in a few days reached the dimensions of a pile of archives such as it takes centuries to accumulate.
"What is this?"
asked the astonished minister. "Proofs against Pyrot," answered General Panther with patriotic satisfaction. "We had not got them when we convicted him, but we have plenty of them now." The door was open, and Greatauk saw coming up the staircase a long file of porters who were unloading heavy bales of paper in the hall, and he saw the lift slowly rising heavily loaded with paper packets.
"What are those others?"
said he. "They are fresh proofs against Pyrot that are now reaching us," said Panther. "I have asked for them in every county of Penguinia, in every staff office and in every court in Europe. I have ordered them in every town in America and in Australia, and in every factory in Africa, and I am expecting bales of them from Bremen and a shipload from Melbourne." And Panther turned towards the Minister of War the tranquil and radiant look of a hero. However, Greatauk, his eyeglass in his eye, was looking at the formidable pile of papers with less satisfaction than uneasiness.
"Very good,"
said he.
"very good. But I am afraid that this Pyrot business may lose its beautiful simplicity. It was limpid. Like a rock crystal, its value lay in its transparency. You could have searched it in vain with a magnifying glass for a straw, a bend, a blot, for the least fault. When it left my hands it was pure as the light. Indeed, it was the light. I give you a pearl and you make a mountain out of it. To tell you the truth, I am afraid that by wishing to do too well you have done less well. Proofs. Of course it is good to have proofs, but perhaps it is better to have none at all. I have already told you, Panther, there is only one irrefutable proof, the confession of the guilty person, or if the innocent, what matter? The Pyrot affair, as I arranged it, left no room for criticism. There was no spot where it could be touched. It defied assault. It was invulnerable because it was invisible. Now it gives an enormous handle for discussion. I advise you, Panther, to use your paper packets with great reserve. I should be particularly grateful if you would be more sparing of your communications to journalists. You speak well, but you say too much. Tell me, Panther, are there any forged documents among these?
There are some adapted ones.
That is what I meant. There are some adapted ones. So much the better. As proofs, forged documents, in general, are better than genuine ones. First of all, because they have been expressly made to suit the needs of the case, to order and measure, and therefore they are fitting and exact. They are also preferable because they carry the mind into an ideal world and turn it aside from the reality which, alas, in this world is never without some alloy. Nevertheless, I think I should have preferred, Panther, that we had no proofs at all.
The first act of the Anti-Pyrotist Association was to ask the government immediately to summon the 700 Pyrotists and their accomplices before the High Court of Justice as guilty of high treason. Prince des Boscénos was charged to speak on behalf of the association and presented himself before the council which had assembled to hear him. He expressed a hope that the vigilance and firmness of the government would rise to the height of the occasion. He shook hands with each of the ministers, and as he passed General Greatauk, he whispered in his ear,
"Behave properly, you ruffian, or I will publish the Mallory dossier."
Some days later, by a unanimous vote of both houses, on a motion proposed by the government, the Anti-Pyrotist Association was granted a charter recognizing it as beneficial to the public interest. The association immediately sent a deputation to Chitterling's castle in Porpoisia, where Crucho was eating the bitter bread of exile, to assure the prince of the love and devotion of the Anti-Pyrotist members. However, the Pyrotists grew in numbers and now counted 10,000. They had their regular cafés on the boulevards, the patriots had theirs also, richer and bigger, and every evening glasses of beer, saucers, match-stands, jugs, chairs and tables were hurled from one to the other. Mirrors were smashed to bits, and the police ended the struggles by impartially trampling the combatants of both parties under their hobnailed shoes. On one of these glorious nights, as Prince des Boscénos was leaving a fashionable café in the company of some patriots, M. de La Trumelle pointed out to him a little bearded man with glasses, hatless and having only one sleeve to his coat, who was painfully dragging himself along the rubbish-strewn pavement.
"Look,"
said he,
"there is Colomban."
The prince had gentleness as well as strength. He was exceedingly mild. But at the name of Colomban his blood boiled. He rushed at the little spectacled man and knocked him down with one blow of his fist on the nose. M. de La Trumelle then perceived that, misled by an undeserved resemblance, he had mistaken for Colomban M. Bazile, a retired lawyer, the secretary of the Anti-Pyrotist Association, and an ardent and generous patriot. Prince des Boscénos was one of those antique souls who never bend. However, he knew how to recognize his faults.
"Monsieur Bazile,"
said he, raising his hat,
"if I have touched your face with my hand, you will excuse me and you will understand me. You will approve of me. Nay, you will compliment me. You will congratulate me and felicitate me when you know the cause of that act. I took you for Colomban."
Monsieur Bazile, wiping his bleeding nostrils with his handkerchief and displaying an elbow laid bare by the absence of his sleeve, "No, sir," answered he dryly, "I shall not felicitate you. I shall not congratulate you. I shall not compliment you, for your action was at the very least superfluous. It was, I will even say, supererogatory. Already this evening I have been 3 times mistaken for Colomban and received a sufficient amount of the treatment he deserves. The patriots have knocked in my ribs and broken my back, and, sir, I was of opinion that that was enough." Scarcely had he finished this speech than a band of Pyrotists appeared, and misled in their turn by that insidious resemblance, they believed that the patriots were killing Colomban. They fell on Prince des Boscénos and his companions with loaded canes and leather thongs and left them for dead. Then seizing Bazile, they carried him in triumph and, in spite of his protests, along the boulevards amid cries of "Hurrah for Colomban! Hurrah for Pyrot!" At last the police, who had been sent after them, attacked and defeated them and dragged them ignominiously to the station, where Bazile, under the name of Colomban, was trampled on by an innumerable quantity of thick hobnailed shoes. End of Book 6, Chapter 6. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Serrois, michael.serrois, SIROIS.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 7. Bidault-Coquille and Maniflore, the Socialists. Whilst the wind of anger and hatred blew in Alca, Eugene Bidault-Coquille, poorest and happiest of astronomers, installed in an old steam engine of the time of the Draconides, was observing the heavens through a bad telescope and photographing the paths of the meteors upon some damaged photographic plates. His genius corrected the errors of his instruments, and his love of science triumphed over the worthlessness of his apparatus. With an inextinguishable ardour he observed aerolites, meteors, and fireballs, and all the glowing ruins and blazing sparks which pass through the terrestrial atmosphere with prodigious speed, and as a reward for his studious vigils he received the indifference of the public, the ingratitude of the state, and the blame of the learned societies. Engulfed in the celestial spaces, he knew not what occurred upon the surface of the earth. He never read the newspapers, and when he walked through the town his mind was occupied with the November asteroids, and more than once he found himself at the bottom of a pond in one of the public parks or beneath the wheels of a motor omnibus. Elevated in stature as in thought, he respected himself and others. This was shown by his cold politeness as well as by a very thin black frock coat and a tall hat, which gave to his person an appearance at once emaciated and sublime. He took his meals in a little restaurant from which all customers less intellectual than himself had fled, and thenceforth his napkin, bound by its wooden ring, rested alone in the abandoned rack. In this cook shop his eyes fell one evening upon Colomban's memorandum in favour of Pyrot. He read it as he was cracking some bad nuts, and suddenly, exalted with astonishment, admiration, horror, and pity, he forgot all about falling meteors and shooting stars, and saw nothing but the innocent man hanging in his cage, exposed to the winds of heaven and the ravens perching upon it. That image did not leave him. For a week he had been obsessed by the innocent convict when, as he was leaving his cook shop, he saw a crowd of citizens entering a public house in which a public meeting was going on. He went in. The meeting was disorderly. They were yelling, abusing one another, and knocking one another down in the smoke-laden hall. The Pyrotists and the anti-Pyrotists spoke in turn and were alternately cheered and hissed at. An obscure and confused enthusiasm moved the audience. With the audacity of a timid and retired man, Bidault Coquille leaped upon the platform and spoke for 3/4 of an hour. He spoke very quickly, without order, but with vehemence, and with all the conviction of a mathematical mystic. He was cheered. When he got down from the platform, a big woman of uncertain age, dressed in red and wearing an immense hat trimmed with heroic feathers, throwing herself into his arms, embraced him and said to him, "You are splendid." He thought in his simplicity that there was some truth in the statement. She declared to him that henceforth she would live but for Pyrot's defence and Colomban's glory. He thought her sublime and beautiful. She was Maniflore, a poor old courtesan, now forgotten and discarded, who had suddenly become a vehement politician. She never left him. They spent glorious hours together in doss houses and in lodgings beautified by their love, in newspaper offices, in meeting halls, and in lecture halls. As he was an idealist, he persisted in thinking her beautiful, although she gave him abundant opportunity of seeing that she had preserved no charm of any kind. From her past beauty she only retained a confidence in her capacity for pleasing and a lofty assurance in demanding homage. Still, it must be admitted that this Pyrot affair, so fruitful in prodigies, invested Maniflore with a sort of civic majesty and transformed her, at public meetings, into an august symbol of justice and truth. Bidault Coquille and Maniflore did not kindle the least spark of irony or amusement in a single anti-Pyrotist, a single defender of Greatauk, or a single supporter of the army. The gods, in their anger, had refused to those men the precious gift of humour. They gravely accused the courtesan and the astronomer of being spies, of treachery, and of plotting against their country. Bidault Coquille and Maniflore grew visibly greater beneath insult, abuse, and calumny. For long months Penguinia had been divided into 2 camps, and though at first sight it may appear strange, hitherto the Socialists had taken no part in the contest. Their groups comprised almost all the manual workers in the country, necessarily scattered, confused, broken up, and divided, but formidable. The Pyrot affair threw the group leaders into a singular embarrassment. They did not wish to place themselves either on the side of the financiers or on the side of the army. They regarded the Jews, both great and small, as their uncompromising opponents. Their principles were not at stake, nor were their interests concerned in the affair. Still the greater number felt how difficult it was growing for them to remain aloof from struggles in which all Penguinia was engaged. Their leaders called a sitting of their federation at the Rue de la Queue du Diable Saint Mael to take into consideration the conduct they ought to adopt in the present circumstances and in future eventualities. Comrade Phoenix was the first to speak. "A crime," said he, "the most odious and cowardly of crimes, a judicial crime, has been committed. Military judges, coerced or misled by their superior officers, have condemned an innocent man to an infamous and cruel punishment. Let us not say that the victim is one of our own party, that he belongs to a caste which was, and always will be, our enemy. Our party is the party of social justice. It can look upon no iniquity with indifference. It would be a shame for us if we left it to Kerdanic, a radical, to Colomban, a member of the middle classes, and to a few moderate republicans alone to proceed against the crimes of the army. If the victim is not one of us, his executioners are our brother's executioners. And before Greatauk struck down this soldier he shot our comrades who were on strike. Comrades, by an intellectual, moral, and material effort, you must rescue Pyrot from his torment, and in performing this generous act You are not turning aside from the liberating and revolutionary task you have undertaken, for Pyrot has become the symbol of the oppressed and of all the social iniquities that now exist. By destroying one, you make all the others tremble." When Phœnix ended, Comrade Sapor spoke in these terms: "You are advised to abandon your task in order to do something with which you have no concern. Why throw yourselves into a conflict where, on whatever side you turn, you will find none but your natural, uncompromising, even necessary opponents? Are the financiers to be less hated by us than the army? What inept and criminal generosity is it that hurries you to save those 700 Pyrotists whom you will always find confronting you in the social war? It is proposed that you act the part of the police for your enemies, and that you are to re-establish for them the order which their own crimes have disturbed. Magnanimity pushed to this degree changes its name. Comrades, there is a point at which infamy becomes fatal to a society. Penguin society is being strangled by its infamy, and you are requested to save it, to give it air that it can breathe. This is simply turning you into ridicule. Leave it to smother itself and let us gaze at its last convulsions with joyful contempt, only regretting that it has so entirely corrupted the soul on which it has been built that we shall find nothing but poisoned mud on which to lay the foundations of a new society." When Sapor had ended his speech, Comrade Lapersonne pronounced these few words: "Phœnix calls us to Pyrot's help for the reason that Pyrot is innocent. It seems to me that that is a very bad reason. If Pyrot is innocent, he has behaved like a good soldier and has always conscientiously worked at his trade, which principally consists in shooting the people. That is not a motive to make the people brave all dangers in his defence. When it is demonstrated to me that Pyrot is guilty and that he stole the army hay, I shall be on his side." Comrade Larrivée afterwards spoke: "I am not of my friend Phœnix's opinion, but I am not with my friend Sapor either. I do not believe that the party is bound to embrace a cause as soon as we are told that the cause is just. That, I am afraid, is a grievous abuse of words and a dangerous equivocation. For social justice is not revolutionary justice. They are both in perpetual antagonism. To serve the one is to oppose the other. As for me, my choice is made. I am for revolutionary justice as against social justice. Still, in the present case, I am against abstention. I say that when a lucky chance brings us an affair like this, we should be fools not to profit by it. How? We are given an opportunity of striking terrible, perhaps fatal blows against militarism. And am I to fold my arms? I tell you, comrades, I am not a fakir. I have never been a fakir. And if there are fakirs here, let them not count on me. To sit in meditation is a policy without results, and one which I shall never adopt. A party like ours ought to be continually asserting itself. It ought to prove its existence by continual action. We will intervene in the Pyrot affair, but we will intervene in it in a revolutionary manner. We will adopt violent action. Perhaps you think that violence is old-fashioned and superannuated, to be scrapped along with diligences, hand presses, and aerial telegraphy. You are mistaken. Today, as yesterday, nothing is obtained except by violence. It is the one efficient instrument. The only thing necessary is to know how to use it. You ask what will our action be? I will tell you. It will be to stir up the governing classes against one another, to put the army in conflict with the capitalists, the government with the magistracy, the nobility and clergy with the Jews, and if possible to drive them all to destroy one another. To do this would be to carry on an agitation which would weaken government in the same way that fever wears out the sick. The Pyrot affair, little as we know how to turn it to advantage, will put forward by 10 years the growth of the social party and the emancipation of the proletariat, by disarmament, the general strike, and revolution. The leaders of the party having each expressed a different opinion, the discussion was continued, not without vivacity. The orators, as always happens in such a case, reproduced the arguments they had already brought forward, though with less order and moderation than before. The dispute was prolonged and none changed his opinion. These opinions, in the final analysis, were reduced to two: that of Sapor and Lapersonne, who advised abstention, and that of Phœnix and Larrivée, who wanted intervention. Even these two contrary opinions were united in a common hatred of the heads of the army and of their justice, and in a common belief in Pyrot's innocence, so that public opinion was hardly mistaken in regarding all the socialist leaders as pernicious anti-Pyrotists. As for the vast masses in whose name they spoke, and whom they represented as far as speech can express the impossible, as for the proletarians whose thought is difficult to know and who do not know it themselves, it seemed that the Pyrot affair did not interest them. It was too literary for them, it was in too classical a style, and had an upper middle class and high finance tone about it that did not please them much. End of Book 6, Chapter 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Sirois, michael.sirois, sirois.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 8. The Colomban Trial. When the Colomban trial began, the Pyrotists were not many more than 30,000, but they were everywhere and might be found even among the priests and millionaires. What injured them most was the sympathy of the rich Jews. On the other hand, they derived valuable advantages from their feeble number. In the first place, there were among them fewer fools than among their opponents, who were overburdened with them. Comprising but a feeble minority, they cooperated easily, acted with harmony, and had no temptation to divide and thus counteract one another's efforts. Each of them felt the necessity of doing the best possible, and was the more careful of his conduct as he found himself more in the public eye. Finally, they had every reason to hope that they would gain fresh adherents, while their opponents, having had everybody with them at the beginning, could only decrease. Summoned before the judges at a public sitting, Colomban immediately perceived that his judges were not anxious to discover the truth. As soon as he opened his mouth, the President ordered him to be silent in the superior interests of the state. For the same reason, which is the supreme reason, the witnesses for the defence were not heard. General Panther, the Chief of Staff, appeared in the witness box, in full uniform and decorated with all his orders. He deposed as follows: "The infamous Colomban states that we have no proofs against Pyrot. He lies. We have them. I have in my archives 732 square yards of them, which at £500 each make £366,000. That superior officer afterwards gave, with elegance and ease, a summary of these proofs. "They are of all colours and all shades," said he in substance. "They are of every form, pot, crown, sovereign, grape, dovecote, grand eagle, etc. The smallest is less than the 100th part of a square inch. The largest measures 70 yards long by 90 yards broad." At this revelation the audience shuddered with horror. Greatauk came to give evidence in his turn. Simpler and perhaps greater, he wore a grey tunic and held his hands joined behind his back. "I leave," said he calmly and in a slightly raised voice, "I leave to Monsieur Colomban the responsibility for an act that has brought our country to the brink of ruin. The Pyrot affair is secret. It ought to remain secret. If it were divulged, the cruellest ills, wars, pillages, depredations, fires, massacres, and epidemics would immediately burst upon Penguinia. I should consider myself guilty of high treason if I uttered another word." Some persons known for their political experience, among others M. Bigourd, considered the evidence of the Minister of War as abler and of greater weight than that of his Chief of Staff. The evidence of Colonel de Boisjoli made a great impression. "One evening at the Ministry of War," said that officer, the attaché of a neighbouring power told me that while visiting his sovereign stables he had once admired some soft and fragrant hay of a pretty green colour, the finest hay he had ever seen. Where did it come from? I asked him. He did not answer, but there seemed to me no doubt about its origin. It was the hay Pyrot had stolen. Those qualities of verdure,
softness and aroma are those of our national hay. The forage of the neighbouring power is grey and brittle. It sounds under the fork and smells of dust. Well, one can draw one's own conclusions."
Lieutenant Colonel Hastaing said in the witness box, amid hisses, that he did not believe Pyrot guilty. He was immediately seized by the police and thrown into the bottom of a dungeon, where, amid vipers, toads, and broken glass, he remained insensible both to promises and threats. The usher called Count Pierre Maubec de la Dentelinx. There was deep silence, and a stately but ill-dressed nobleman, whose moustaches pointed to the skies and whose dark eyes shot forth flashing glances, was seen advancing toward the witness box. He approached Colomban and, casting upon him a look of ineffable disdain, "My evidence," said he, "here it is, you excrement." At these words the entire hall burst into enthusiastic applause and jumped up, moved by one of those transports that stir men's hearts and rouse them to extraordinary actions. Without another word, Count Maubec de la Dentelinx withdrew. All those present left the court and formed a procession behind him. Prostrate at his feet, Princess des Boscénos held his legs in a close embrace, but he went on, stern and impassive, beneath a shower of handkerchiefs and flowers. Viscountess Olive, clinging to his neck, could not be removed, and the calm hero bore her along with him, floating on his breast like a light scarf. When the court resumed its sitting, which it had been compelled to suspend, the President called the experts. Vermillard, the famous expert in handwriting, gave the results of his researches. "Having carefully studied," said he, "the papers found in Pyrot's house, in particular his account book and his laundry books, I noticed that, although apparently not out of the common, they formed an impenetrable cryptogram, the key to which, however, I discovered. The traitor's infamy is to be seen in every line. In this system of writing the words 3 glasses of beer and 20 francs for Adèle mean I have delivered 30,000 trusses of hay to a neighbouring power. From these documents I have even been able to establish the composition of the hay delivered by this officer. The words waistcoat, drawers, pocket handkerchief, collars, drink, tobacco, cigars, mean clover, meadowgrass, lucerne, burnet, oats, ryegrass, vernal grass, and common cat's tail grass. And these are precisely the constituents of the hay furnished by Count Maubec to the Penguin cavalry. In this way Pyrot mentioned his crimes in a language that he believed would always remain indecipherable. One is confounded by so much astuteness and so great a want of conscience." Colomban, pronounced guilty without any extenuating circumstances, was condemned to the severest penalty. The judges immediately signed a warrant consuming him to solitary confinement. In the Place du Palais, on the sides of a river whose banks had, during the course of 12 centuries, seen so great a history, 50,000 persons were tumultuously awaiting the result of the trial. Here were the heads of the Anti-Pyrotist Association, among whom might be seen Prince des Boscénos, Count Cléna, Viscount Olive, and M. de La Trumelle. Here crowded the Reverend Father Agaric and the teachers of St. Maël College with their pupils. Here the monk Douillard and General Caraguel, embracing each other, formed a sublime group. The market women and laundry women, with spits, shovels, tongs, beetles, and kettles full of water, might be seen running across the Pont Vieux. On the steps in front of the bronze gates were assembled all the defenders of Pyrot and Alca, professors, publicists, workmen, some conservatives, others radicals or revolutionaries, and by their negligent dress and fierce aspect could be recognized comrades Phoenix, Larrivée, Lapersonne, Dagobert, and Varambille. Squeezed in his funereal frock-coat and wearing his hat of ceremony, Bidault Coquille invoked the sentimental mathematics on behalf of Colomban and Colonel Hastaing. Maniflore shone smiling and resplendent on the topmost step, anxious, like Leanna, to deserve a glorious monument or to be given, like Epicharis, the praises of history. The 700 Pyrotists, disguised as lemonade sellers, utter merchants, collectors of odds and ends, or anti-Pyrotists, wandered round the vast building. When Colomban appeared, so great an uproar burst forth that, struck by the commotion of air and water, birds fell from the trees and fishes floated on the surface of the stream. On all sides there were yells.
"Duck Colomban! Duck him! Duck him!"
There were some cries of
"Justice! Justice! Truth!"
and a voice was even heard shouting,
"Down with the army!"
This was the signal for a terrible struggle. The combatants fell in thousands, and their bodies formed howling and moving mounds on top of which fresh champions gripped each other by the throats. Women, eager, pale, and dishevelled, with clenched teeth and frantic nails, rushed on the man, in transports that in the brilliant light of the public square gave to their faces expressions unsurpassed even in the shade of curtains and in the hollows of pillows. They were going to seize Colomban, to bite him, to strangle, dismember, and rend him, when Maniflore, tall and dignified in her red tunic, stood forth, serene and terrible, confronting these furies who recoiled from before her in terror. Colomban seemed to be saved. His partisans succeeded in clearing a passage for him through the Place du Palais and in putting him into a cab stationed at the corner of the Pont Vieux. The horse was already in full trot when Prince des Boscénos, Count Cléna, and M. de La Trumelle knocked the driver off his seat. Then, making the animal back and pushing the spokes of the wheels, they ran the vehicle on to the parapet of the bridge, whence they overturned it into the river amid the cheers of the delirious crowd. With a resounding splash a jet of water rose upwards, and then nothing but a slight eddy was to be seen on the surface of the stream. Almost immediately comrades Dagobert and Varambille, with the help of the 700 disguised Pyrotists, sent Prince des Boscénos head foremost into a river laundry in which he was lamentably swallowed up. Serene night descended over the Place du Palais and shed silence and peace upon the frightful ruins with which it was strewed. In the meantime Colomban, 3,000 yards down the stream, cowering beside a lame old horse on a bridge, was meditating on the ignorance and injustice of crowds.
"The business,"
said he to himself,
"is even more troublesome than I believed. I foresee fresh difficulties."
He got up and approached the unhappy animal.
"What have you, poor friend, done to them?" said he. "It is on my account they have used you so cruelly."
He embraced the unfortunate beast and kissed the white star on his forehead. Then he took him by the bridle and led him, both of them limping, through the sleeping city to his house, where sleep soon allowed them to forget mankind. End of Book 6, Chapter 8. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Sirois, michael.sirois, sirois.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 9. Father Douillard. In their infinite gentleness and at the suggestion of the common Father of the Faithful, the bishops, canons, vicars, curates, abbots and friars of Penguinia resolved to hold a solemn service in the cathedral of Alca and to pray that divine mercy would deign to put an end to the troubles that distracted one of the noblest countries in Christendom, and grant to repentant Penguinia pardon for its crimes against God and the ministers of religion. The ceremony took place on the 15th of June. General Caraguel, surrounded by his staff, occupied the churchwarden's pew. The congregation was numerous and brilliant. According to M. Bigord's expression, it was both crowded and select. In the front rank was to be seen M. de la Berthe-aux-Sales, chamberlain to His Highness Prince Crucho. Near the pulpit, which was to be ascended by the Reverend Father Douillard of the Order of St. Francis, were gathered in an attitude of attention, with their hands crossed upon their wands of office, the great dignitaries of the Anti-Pyrotist Association, Viscount Olive, M. de La Trumelle, Count Cléna, the Duc d'Ampoule, and Prince des Boscénos. Father Agaric was in the apse with the teachers and pupils of St. Maël College. The right-hand transept and aisle were reserved for officers and soldiers in uniform, this side being thought the more honourable, since the Lord leaned his head to the right when he died on the cross. The ladies of the aristocracy, and among them Countess Cléna, Viscountess Olive, and Princess des Boscénos, occupied reserved seats. In the immense building and in the square outside were gathered 20,000 clergy of all sorts, as well as 30,000 of the laity. After the expiatory and propitiatory ceremony, the Reverend Father Douillard ascended the pulpit. The sermon had at first been entrusted to the Reverend Father Agaric, but in spite of his merits he was thought unequal to the occasion in zeal and doctrine, and the eloquent Capuchin friar, who for 6 months had gone through the barracks preaching against the enemies of God and authority, had been chosen in his place. The Reverend Father Douillard, taking as his text, "He hath put down the mighty from their seat," established that all temporal power has God as its principle and its end, and that it is ruined and destroyed when it turns aside from the path that Providence has traced out for it and from the end to which he has directed it. Applying these sacred rules to the government of Penguinia, he drew a terrible picture of the evils that the country's rulers had been unable either to prevent or to foresee. "The first author of these miseries and degradations, my brethren," said he, "is only too well known to you. He is a monster whose destiny is providentially proclaimed by his name, for it is derived from the Greek word pyros, which means fire. Eternal wisdom warns us by this etymology that a Jew was to set ablaze the country that had welcomed him." He depicted the country, persecuted by the persecutors of the Church and crying in its agony, "O woe! O glory! Those who have crucified my God are crucifying me." At these words a prolonged shudder passed through the assembly. The powerful orator excited still greater indignation when he described the proud and crime-stained Colomban plunged into the stream, all the waters of which could not cleanse him. He gathered up all the humiliations and all the perils of the Penguins in order to reproach the President of the Republic and the Prime Minister with them. "That minister," said he, "having been guilty of degrading cowardice in not exterminating the 700 Pyrotists with their allies and defenders, as Saul exterminated the Philistines at Gibeah, has rendered himself unworthy of exercising the power that God delegated to him, and every good citizen ought henceforth to insult his contemptible government. Heaven will look favourably on those who despise him. He hath put down the mighty from their seat. God will depose these pusillanimous chiefs and will put in their place strong men who will call upon him. I tell you, gentlemen, I tell you, officers, non-commissioned officers, and soldiers who listen to me, I tell you, general of the Penguin armies, the hour has come. If you do not obey God's orders, if in his name you do not depose those now in authority, if you do not establish a religious and strong government in Penguinia, God will none the less destroy what he has condemned. He will none the less save his people. He will save them. But if you are wanting, he will do so by means of a humble artisan or a simple corporal. Hasten, the hour will soon be past." Excited by this ardent exhortation, the 60,000 people present rose up trembling and shouting,
To arms! To arms! Death to the Pyrotists! Hurrah for Crucho!
And all of them, monks, women, soldiers, noblemen, citizens, and loafers, who were gathered beneath the superhuman arm uplifted in the pulpit, struck up the hymn, "Let us save Penguinia." They rushed impetuously from the basilica and marched along the quays to the Chamber of Deputies. Left alone in the deserted nave, the wise Cornemuse, lifting his arms to heaven, murmured in broken accents, "Agnosco fortunam ecclesiae penguicanae." I see but too well whither this will lead us. The attack which the crowd made upon the Legislative Palace was repulsed. Vigorously charged by the police and Alcan guards, the assailants were already fleeing in disorder when the Socialists, running from the slums and led by comrades Phoenix, Dagobert, Lapersonne, and Varambille, threw themselves upon them and completed their discomfiture. Messieurs de La Trumelle and d'Ampoule were taken to the police station. Prince des Boscénos, after a valiant struggle, fell upon the bloody pavement with a fractured skull. In the enthusiasm of victory, the comrades, mingled with an innumerable crowd of paper sellers and gutter merchants, ran through the boulevards all night, carrying Maniflore in triumph and breaking the mirrors of the cafés and the glasses of the street lamps amid cries of
"Down with Crucho! Hurrah for the social revolution!"
The anti-Pyrotists, in their turn, upset the newspaper kiosks and tore down the hoardings. These were spectacles of which cool reason cannot approve, and they were fit causes for grief to the municipal authorities, who desired to preserve the good order of the roads and streets. But what was sadder for a man of heart was the sight of the canting humbugs, who from fear of blows kept at an equal distance from the two camps, and who, although they allowed their selfishness and cowardice to be visible, claimed admiration for the generosity of their sentiments and the nobility of their souls. They rubbed their eyes with onions, gaped like whitings, blew violently into their handkerchiefs, and bringing their voices out of the depths of their stomachs, groaned forth, "Oh, Penguins, cease these fratricidal struggles, cease to rend your mother's bosom." As if men could live in society without disputes and without quarrels, and as if civil discords were not the necessary conditions of national life and progress, they showed themselves hypocritical cowards by proposing a compromise between the just and the unjust, offending the just in his rectitude and the unjust in his courage. One of these creatures, the great and powerful Mael, a champion coward, rose upon the town like a colossus of grief. His tears formed poisonous lakes at his feet, and his sighs capsized the boats of the fishermen. During these stormy nights, Bidault Coquille, at the top of his old steam engine, under the serene sky, boasted in his heart, while the shooting stars registered themselves upon his photographic plates. He was fighting for justice. He loved and was loved with a sublime passion. Insult and calumny raised him to the clouds. A caricature of him in company with those of Colomban, Kerdanic, and Colonel Hastaing was to be seen in the newspaper kiosks. The anti-Pyrotists proclaimed that he had received 50,000 francs from the big Jewish financiers. The reports of the militarist sheets held interviews regarding his scientific knowledge with official scholars, who declared he had no knowledge of the stars, disputed his most solid observations, denied his most certain discoveries, and condemned his most ingenious and most fruitful hypotheses. He exulted under these flattering blows of hatred and envy. He contemplated the black immensity pierced by a multitude of lights without giving a thought to all the heavy slumbers, cruel insomnias, vain dreams, spoilt pleasures, and infinitely diverse miseries that a great city contains. "It is in this enormous city," said he to himself, "that the just and the unjust are joining battle." And substituting a simple and magnificent poetry for the multiple and vulgar reality, he represented to himself the Pyrot affair as a struggle between good and bad angels. He awaited the eternal triumph of the sons of light and congratulated himself on being a child of the day, confounding the children of night. End of Book 6, Chapter 9. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Serrois. Michael.Serrois, SIROIS.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 10. Mr. Justice Chospied. Hitherto blinded by fear, incautious and stupid before the bands of Friar Douillard and the partisans of Prince Crucho, the Republicans at last opened their eyes and grasped the real meaning of the Pyrot affair. The deputies, who had for 2 years turned pale at the shouts of the patriotic crowds, became not indeed more courageous, but altered their cowardice and blamed Robin Mielleux for disorders which their own compliance had encouraged and the instigators of which they had several times slavishly congratulated. They reproached him for having imperilled the Republic by a weakness which was really theirs, and a timidity which they themselves had imposed upon him. Some of them began to doubt whether it was not to their interest to believe in Pyrot's innocence rather than in his guilt, and thenceforward they felt a bitter anguish at the thought that the unhappy man might have been wrongly convicted, and that in his aerial cage he might be expiating another man's crimes.
"I cannot sleep on account of it,"
was what several members of Minister Guillaumet's majority used to say. but these were ambitious to replace their chief. These generous legislators overthrew the cabinet, and the President of the Republic put in Robin Mielleux's place a patriarchal republican with a flowing beard, La Trinité by name, who, like most of the Penguins, understood nothing about the affair, but thought that too many monks were mixed up in it. General Greatauk, before leaving the Ministry of War, gave his final advice to Parillaud, the chief of the staff. "I go and you remain," said he as he shook hands with him. "The Pyrot affair is my daughter. I confess her to you. She is worthy of your love and your care. She is beautiful. Do not forget that her beauty loves the shade, is leased with mystery, and likes to remain veiled. Great her modesty with gentleness. Too many indiscreet looks have already profaned her charms. Panther, you desired proofs and you obtained them. You have many, perhaps too many, in your possession. I see that there will be many tiresome interventions and much dangerous curiosity. If I were in your place, I would tear up all those documents. Believe me, the best of proofs is none at all. That is the only one which nobody discusses." Alas! General Panther did not realize the wisdom of this advice. The future was only too thoroughly to justify Greatauk's perspicacity. La Trinité demanded the documents belonging to the Pyrot affair. Péniche, his Minister of War, refused them in the superior interests of the national defence, telling him that the documents under General Panther's care formed the hugest mass of archives in the world. La Trinité studied the case as well as he could, and, without penetrating to the bottom of the matter, suspected it of irregularity. Conformably to his rights and prerogatives, he then ordered a fresh trial to be held. Immediately, Péniche, his Minister of War, accused him of insulting the army and betraying the country, and flung his portfolio at his head. He was replaced by a second, who did the same. To him succeeded a third, who imitated these examples, and those after him to the number of 70 acted like their predecessors, until the venerable La Trinité groaned beneath the weight of bellicose portfolios. The 71st Minister of War, Van Julep, retained office. Not that he was in disagreement with so many and such noble colleagues, but he had been commissioned by them generously to betray his Prime Minister, to cover him with shame and opprobrium, and to convert the new trial to the glory of Greatauk, the satisfaction of the anti-Pyrotists, the profit of the monks, and the restoration of Prince Crucho. General Van Julep, though endowed with high military virtues, was not intelligent enough to employ the subtle conduct and exquisite methods of Greatauk. He thought, like General Panther, that tangible proofs against Pyrot were necessary, that they could never have too many of them, that they could never have even enough. He expressed these sentiments to his Chief of Staff, who was only too inclined to agree with them. "Panther," said he, "we are at the moment when we need abundant and superabundant proofs." "You have said enough, General," answered Panther. "I will complete my piles of documents." 6 months later the proofs against Pyrot filled 2 stories of the Ministry of War. The ceiling fell in beneath the weight of the bundles, and the avalanche of falling documents crushed 2 head clerks, 14 second clerks, and 60 copying clerks, who were at work on the ground floor arranging a change in the fashion of the cavalry gaiters. The walls of the huge edifice had to be propped. Passers-by saw with amazement enormous beams and monstrous stanchions which reared themselves obliquely against the noble front of the building, now tottering and disjointed, and blocked up the streets, stopped the carriages, and presented to the motor omnibuses an obstacle against which they dashed with their loads of passengers. The judges who had condemned Pyrot were not, properly speaking, judges but soldiers. The judges who had condemned Colomban were real judges, but of inferior rank, wearing seedy black clothes like church vergers, unlikely wretches of judges, miserable judgelings. Above them were the superior judges who wore ermine robes over their black gowns. These, renowned for their knowledge and doctrine, formed a court whose terrible name expressed power. It was called the Court of Appeal, Cassation, so as to make it clear that it was the hammer suspended over the judgments and decrees of all other jurisdictions. One of these superior head judges of the Supreme Court, called Chaussepierre, led a modest and tranquil life in a suburb of Alca. His soul was pure, his heart honest, his spirit just. When he had finished studying his documents, he used to play the violin and cultivate hyacinths. Every Sunday he dined with his neighbours, the Mesdemoiselles Herbivore. His old age was cheerful and robust, and his friends often praised the amenity of his character. For some months, however, he had been irritable and touchy, and when he opened a newspaper his broad and ruddy face would become covered with dolorous wrinkles and darkened with an angry purple. Pyrot was the cause of it. Justice Chaussepieid could not understand how an officer could have committed so black a crime as to hand over 80,000 trusses of military hay to a neighbouring and hostile power, and he could still less conceive how a scoundrel should have found official defenders in Penguinia. The thought that there existed in his country a Pyrot, a Colonel Hastaing, a Colomban, a Kerdanic, a Phoenix, spoilt his hyacinths, his violin, his heaven and his earth, all nature, and even his dinner with the Mesdemoiselles Herbivore. In the meantime, the Pyrot case having been presented to the Supreme Court by the Keeper of Seals, it fell to Chaussepieid to examine it and cover its defects in case any existed. Although as upright and as honest as a man can be, and trained by long habit to exercise his magistracy without fear or favour, he expected to find in the documents he submitted to him proofs of certain guilt and obvious criminality. After lengthened difficulties and repeated refusals on the part of General Julep, Justice Chaussepieid was allowed to examine the documents. Numbered and initialled, they ran to the number of 14,626,312. As he studied them, the judge was at first surprised, then astonished, then stupefied, amazed, and, if I dare say so, flabbergasted. He found among the documents prospectuses of new fancy shops, newspapers, fashion plates, paper bags, old business letters, exercise books, brown paper, green paper for rubbing parquet floors, playing cards, diagrams, 6,000 copies of the Key to Dreams, but not a single document in which any mention was made of Pyrot. End of Book 6, Chapter 10. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Serrois, michael.serrois, sirois.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 6, Modern Times. Book 6, Chapter 11. Conclusion. The appeal was allowed, and Pyrot was brought down from his cage. But the anti-Pyrotists did not regard themselves as beaten. The military judges retried Pyrot. Greatauk, in this second affair, surpassed himself. He obtained a second conviction. He obtained it by declaring that the proofs communicated to the Supreme Court were worth nothing, and that great care had been taken to keep back the good ones, since they ought to remain secret. In the opinion of connoisseurs, he had never shown so much address. On leaving the court, as he passed through the vestibule with a tranquil step and his hands behind his back, amidst a crowd of sightseers, a woman dressed in red and with her face covered by a black veil rushed at him, brandishing a kitchen knife.
"Die, scoundrel!"
she cried. It was Maniflore. Before those present could understand what was happening, the general seized her by the wrist and with apparent gentleness squeezed it so forcibly that the knife fell from her aching hand. Then he picked it up and handed it to Maniflore.
"Madam,"
said he with a bow,
"you have dropped a household utensil."
He could not prevent the heroine from being taken to the police station, but he had her immediately released, and afterwards he employed all his influence to stop the prosecution. The second conviction of Pyrot was Greatauk's last victory. Justice Chaussepieid, who had formerly liked soldiers so much and esteemed their justice so highly, being now enraged with the military judges, quashed their judgments as a monkey cracks nuts. He rehabilitated Pyrot a second time. He would, if necessary, have rehabilitated him 500 times. Furious at having been cowards and at having allowed themselves to be deceived and made game of, the Republicans turned against the monks and clergy. The deputies passed laws of expulsion, separation, and spoliation against them. What Father Cornemuse had foreseen took place. That good monk was driven from the wood of Connels. Treasury officers confiscated his retorts and his stills, and the liquidators divided amongst them his bottles of St. Orberosian liqueur. The pious distiller lost the annual income of 3,500,000 francs that his products procured for him. Father Agaric went into exile, abandoning his school into the hands of laymen, who soon allowed it to fall into decay. Separated from its foster mother, the State, the Church of Penguinia withered like a plucked flower. The victorious defenders of the innocent man now abused each other and overwhelmed each other reciprocally with insults and calumnies. The vehement Kerdanic hurled himself upon Phœnix as if ready to devour him. The wealthy Jews and the 700 Pyrotists turned away with disdain from the socialist comrades whose aid they had humbly implored in the past.
"We know you no longer,"
said they.
"To the devil with you and your social justice. Social justice is the defence of property."
Having been elected a deputy and chosen to be the leader of the new majority, Comrade Larrivée was appointed by the Chamber and public opinion to the premiership. He showed himself an energetic defender of the military tribunals that had condemned Pyrot. When his former socialist comrades claimed a little more justice and liberty for the employees of the State as well as for manual workers, he opposed their proposals in an eloquent speech.
"Liberty," said he, "is not license. Between order and disorder my choice is made. Revolution is impotence. Progress has no more formidable enemy than violence. Gentlemen, those who, as I am, are anxious for reform, ought to apply themselves before everything else to cure this agitation which enfeebles government just as fever exhausts those who are ill. It is time to reassure honest people."
This speech was received with applause. The government of the Republic remained in subjection to the great financial companies. The army was exclusively devoted to the defence of capital, while the fleet was designed solely to procure fresh orders from the mine owners. Since the rich refused to pay their just share of the taxes, the poor, as in the past, paid for them. In the meantime, from the height of his old steam line, beneath the crowded stars of night, Bidault Coquille gazed sadly at the sleeping city. Maniflore had left him. Consumed with a desire for fresh devotions and fresh sacrifices, she had gone in company with a young Bulgarian to bear justice and vengeance to Sofia. He did not regret her, having perceived after the affair that she was less beautiful in form and in thought than he had at first imagined. His impressions had been modified in the same direction concerning many other forms and many other thoughts. And what was cruellest of all to him, he regarded himself as not so great, not so splendid as he had believed. And he reflected.
You considered yourself sublime when you had but candour and goodwill. Of what were you proud, Bidault Coquille? Of having been one of the first to know that Pyrot was innocent and Greatauk a scoundrel? But 3/4 of those who defended Greatauk against the attacks of the 700 Pyrotists knew that better than you. Of what then did you show yourself so proud? Of having dared to say what you thought? That is civic courage, and like military courage, it is a mere result of imprudence. You have been imprudent. So far, so good. But that is no reason for praising yourself beyond measure. Your imprudence was trifling. It exposed you to trifling perils. You did not risk your head by it. The Penguins have lost that cruel and sanguinary pride which formerly gave a tragic grandeur to their revolutions. It is the fatal result of the weakening of beliefs in character. Ought one to look upon oneself as a superior spirit for having shown a little more clear-sightedness than the vulgar? I am very much afraid, on the contrary, Bidault Coquille, that you have given proof of a gross misunderstanding of the conditions of the moral and intellectual development of a people. You imagined that social injustices were threaded together like pearls, and that it would be enough to pull one off in order to unfasten the whole necklace. That is a very ingenious conception. You flattered yourself that at one stroke you were establishing justice in your own country and in the universe. You were a brave man, an honest idealist, though without much experimental philosophy. But go home to your own heart, and you will recognize that you had in you a spice of malice, and that our ingenuousness was not without cunning. You believed you were performing a fine moral action. You said to yourself, "Here am I, just and courageous once for all. I can henceforth repose in the public esteem and the praise of historians." And now that you have lost your illusions, now that you know how hard it is to redress wrongs and that the task must ever be begun afresh, you are going back to your asteroids. You are right, but go back to them with modesty, Bidault Coquille. End of Chapter 11 and the end of Book 6. This is a LibriVox recording.
All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading is by Michael Sirois, michael.sirois, sirois.com. Penguin Island by Anatole, France. Book 7, Modern Times, Madame Sarret. Book 7, Chapter 1, Madame Clarence's Drawing Room. The chapter begins with a quote. "Only extreme things are tolerable." Count Robert de Montesquieu. Madame Clarence, the widow of an exalted functionary of the Republic, loved to entertain. Every Thursday she collected together some friends of modest condition who took pleasure in conversation. The ladies who went to see her, very different in age and rank, were all without money, and all had suffered much. There was a duchess who looked like a fortune-teller, and a fortune-teller who looked like a duchess. Madame Clarence was pretty enough to maintain some old liaisons, but not to form new ones, and she generally inspired a quiet esteem. She had a very pretty daughter who, since she had no dower, caused some alarm among the male guests, for the Penguins were as much afraid of portionless girls as they were of the devil himself. Eveline Clarence, noticing their reserve and perceiving its cause, used to hand them their tea with an air of disdain. Moreover, she seldom appeared at the parties and talked only to the ladies or the very young people. Her discreet and retiring presence put no restraint upon the conversation, since those who took part in it thought either that as she was a young girl she would not understand it, or that, being 25 years old, she might listen to everything. One Thursday, therefore, in Madame Clarence's drawing room, the conversation turned upon love. The ladies spoke of it with pride, delicacy, and mystery, the men with discretion and fatuity. Everyone took an interest in the conversation, for each one was interested in what he or she said. A great deal of wit flowed, brilliant apostrophes were launched forth, and keen repartees were returned. But when Professor Haddock began to speak, he overwhelmed everybody. "It is the same with our ideas on love as with our ideas on everything else," said he. "They rest upon anterior habits whose very memory has been effaced. In morals, the limitations that have lost their grounds for existing, the most useless obligations, the cruellest and most injurious restraints, are because of their profound antiquity and the mystery of their origin. The least disputed and the least disputable, as well as the most respected, and they are those that cannot be violated without incurring the most severe blame. All morality relative to the relations of the sexes is founded on this principle, that a woman once obtained belongs to the man, that she is his property like his horse or his weapons, and this having ceased to be true, absurdities result from it, such as the marriage or contract or sale of a woman to a man, with clauses restricting the right of ownership, introduced as a consequence of the gradual diminution of the claims of the possessor. The obligation imposed on a girl that she should bring her virginity to her husband comes from the times when girls were married immediately they were of a marriageable age. It is ridiculous that a girl who marries at 25 or 30 should be subject to that obligation. You will perhaps say that it is a present with which her husband, if she gets one at last, will be gratified. But every moment we see men wooing married women and showing themselves perfectly satisfied to take them as they find them. Still, even in our own day, the duty of girls is determined in religious morality by the old belief that God, the most powerful of warriors, is polygamous, that he has reserved all maidens for himself, and that men can only take those whom he has left. This belief, although traces of it exist in several metaphors of mysticism, is abandoned to-day by most civilized peoples. However, it still dominates the education of girls, not only among our believers, but even among our free thinkers, who, as a rule, think freely for the reason that they do not think at all. Discretion means ability to separate and discern. We say that a girl is discreet when she knows nothing at all. We cultivate her ignorance. In spite of all our care, the most discreet know something, for we cannot conceal from them their own nature and their own sensations. But they know badly, they know in a wrong way. That is all we obtain by our careful education.
"Sir,"
suddenly said Joseph Boutourle, the High Treasurer of Alca.
Believe me, there are innocent girls, perfectly innocent girls, and it is a great pity. I have known 3. They married, and the result was tragical."
"I have noticed," Professor Haddock went on, "that Europeans in general and Penguins in particular occupy themselves, after sport and motoring, with nothing so much as with love. It is giving a great deal of importance to a matter that has very little weight."
"Then, Professor," exclaimed Madame Crémeur in a choking voice, "when a woman has completely surrendered herself to you, you think it is a matter of no importance?"
"No, madame, it can have its importance," answered Professor Haddock, "but it is necessary to examine if, when she surrenders herself to us, she offers us a delicious fruit garden or a plot of thistles and dandelions. And then, do we not misuse words? In love a woman lends herself rather than gives herself. Look at the pretty Madame Pensée."
"She is my mother," said a tall, fair young man.
"Sir, I have the greatest respect for her," replied Professor Haddock. "Do not be afraid that I intend to say anything in the least offensive about her. But allow me to tell you that as a rule the opinions of sons about their mothers are not to be relied on. They do not bear enough in mind that a mother is a mother only because she loved and that she can still love. That, however, is the case, and it would be deplorable were it otherwise. I have noticed, on the contrary, that daughters do not deceive themselves about their mother's faculty for loving, or about the use they make of it. They are rivals. They have their eyes upon them."
The insupportable Professor spoke a great deal longer, adding indecorum to awkwardness, and impertinence to incivility, accumulating incongruities, despising what is respectable, respecting what is despicable, but no one listened to him further.
During this time, in a room that was simple without grace, a room sad for the want of love, a room which, like all young girls' rooms, had something of the cold atmosphere of a place of waiting about it, Eveline Clarence turned over the pages of club annuals and prospectuses of charities in order to obtain from them some acquaintance with society. Being convinced that her mother, shut up in her own intellectual but poor world, could neither bring her out or push her into prominence, she decided that she herself would seek the best means of winning a husband. At once calm and obstinate, without dreams or illusions, and regarding marriage as but a ticket of admission or a passport, she kept before her mind a clear notion of the hazards, difficulties, and chances of her enterprise. She had the art of pleasing and a coldness of temperament that enabled her to turn it to its fullest advantage. Her weakness lay in the fact that she was dazzled by anything that had an aristocratic air. When she was alone with her mother, she said:
"Mamma, we will go to-morrow to Father Douillard's retreat."
End of Book 7, Chapter 1.